Happy holidays, Screen Junkies. Escape the endless hours of family time with this special episode you may have missed.
Hey Screen Junkies, back in February I had a chance to talk to legendary film critic and writer Leonard Maltin about one of the greatest directors in movie history, Billy Wilder. It was a great discussion and I'm super excited that you can see it right here on Screen Junkies News. Happy holidays! Hello Screen Junkies and welcome to a very special edition of Dan's Labyrinth here on this holiday Monday. We're not live today, but I am super excited for this episode. As you know, this is the time to talk about the second edition of our Dan's Movie Club. Movie Club number 1 was about Sidney Lumet. This one was about Billy Wilder, and I am beyond thrilled and honored to have an incredibly esteemed film critic and somebody who I read growing up and who I continue to look up to as far as film criticism. And by the way, the perfect guest for this episode, Mr. Leonard Maltin, joining me here today. Thank you so much for coming in.
What a nice introduction. Thank you, Dan.
So, you know, when they said that you were able to come in, I thought this was great because Billy Wilder, and we were talking...
Well, that was the magic words.
Right.
You, not so much. But truly, I mean, to talk in a public forum about Billy Wilder movies, that's it. I'm there, and here I am.
Well, thank you so much for coming. And I mentioned before, you know, I give out 3 movies every month for people to watch, different categories. And I was saying with Billy Wilder, I felt like I could give out 3 and then 3 more.
Yep.
And then 3 more and just
then
keep
maybe
going.
even 3 more.
Exactly. It's his filmography, the breadth of it, and across genres, across the years, multiple Best Picture Oscar winners, and just some really classic movies. Just in general, what do you think Billy Wilder's legacy? You know, what did he leave on the face of movies throughout the decades of his work?
Well, let's see. Wit. That's the first word that comes to mind, actually. Wit, intelligence, versatility, great performances, great collaborations. You know, with not just with his writing partners, but and with his actors, obviously. But he worked with the great movie composer Franz Waxman, who did some fantastic scores for Wilder's films, especially the earlier ones. Alexander Trauner, one of the legendary production designers, was a European emigre like Wilder, did some of his most incredible production designs for Wilder movies, including one of the ones in particular we'll talk about later. Just, you know, he was a guy who worked with the best, who sought the best, who worked hard to make each film different from the last.
Right.
Never wanted to copy himself, never wanted to repeat himself. I mean, that's one of the things I think that makes him so admirable.
And so unique. One of the things that, you know, I continually have to remind myself of in watching his movies, which, you know, most of which he co-wrote with various writing partners, is that they all have such a mastery of the English language and also just a mastery of culture, of either, you know, in Sunset Boulevard, the Hollywood culture, in New York, the corporate culture of that time. You have to keep reminding yourself that Billy Wilder was an immigrant. He you know, he was not born here in the United States.
And well, some people feel that may have been an asset. I think he's even said that he, as an outsider, had a different slant, a different point of view, a sort of a different prism for seeing American culture and American life. And maybe that's why he was so observant of things that maybe we take for granted.
Right.
Or we wouldn't, you know, underscore or highlight in some way, that he would. And he did always work with partners, which is interesting too. And I think he wanted not just a sounding board, but I think he had a certain insecurity about his not being American.
Right.
And maybe leaned on Charles Brackett as longtime partner, and then I.A.L. Diamond as a later partner, and a couple of others in between. But it all came back to him.
Right.
Because he then interpreted what they had on the page as the director and got it on the screen.
Well, the 3 movies that we did for this one, not just 3 of my favorite Billy Wilder movies, 3 of my favorite movies of any director of any decade.
Excellent taste you have.
Double Indemnity, Sunset Boulevard, and The Apartment. And one thing that, I mean, we'll go into each one individually, but, you know, when you watch them all together, I felt this way with Sidney Lumet's movies a little bit, you notice things. These 3 in particular, and I didn't pick them for this reason, but as I watched each one, I was really struck by it, is they all deal with for that time, very subversive themes. They all deal with adultery, affairs, but it's in a time and an age where you couldn't show that, you could barely even imply that, and yet he had a way of dealing with these issues that there's no question in your mind about what was going on, but the ratings boards couldn't, there's nothing to really point to that says this is offensive, but he had this way of dealing with these issues.
He had to subvert the censorship of the time, and people who don't know this or aren't seeped in Hollywood history have to know that until the late 60s, I mean, you couldn't swear on screen, not at all.
Right.
Not once. You couldn't show sex. You couldn't show anything that even looked like sex.
Right.
You couldn't, violence had to be muted. There was a silly law in the production code that said if somebody fired a gun, you couldn't show in a single shot the gun shot and the bullet landing at its target. You could have a person firing, and then you could have a cutaway, somebody going, ugh. But that was, and then no blood, of course.
Right.
Very, very little, nothing in the way of graphic violence. It's such a 180 spin from what we're all so accustomed to today. And of course, he too lived long enough to make films after the collapse of the production code, and which is to say the early 70s and into the mid 70s and beyond. And though one could argue there's some very good films there too, I think having to sort of be clever enough to weasel around the code may have been an asset.
Right.
May have forced him to be more creative, and his writing partner too, to find more ingenious ways to imply and to infer things that we get.
Right.
You watch the films and, they're still sexy, they're still subversive, they're still razor sharp, and yet they don't step over the line in terms of that ledger book of what they could and could not do.
Well, it's hard to know where to start, so we can start at just the first, chronologically, the first movie in here, which is Double Indemnity. Mm-hmm. A classic in the film noir genre. Billy Wilder wrote this with Raymond Chandler, who was the great mystery writer. He wrote The Big Sleep and so many other great films and novels and everything else. Fred MacMurray.
And is based on a novel by James M. Cain, the author who wrote Mildred Pierce and The Postman Always Rings Twice, and other films, other novels and short stories that turned into a pretty successful film noir as well.
Fred MacMurray is somebody who, he had later on, My Three Sons, very family friendly, very wholesome. He looks like a wholesome guy. I think that's why I like in this movie, and then later in The Apartment, kind of a different character, but he was kind of the bad guy,
those are the two times. Those are the two times. I mean, there may have been a couple of others where he wasn't the nice guy, but that was his standard persona, if you will.
A Disney star, absent-minded
professor
right.
And Flubber and the Shaggy Dog and all of that. But Wilder was under contract to Paramount, and again, people who don't know how things worked in the old days, the studios were movie factories, and they had everybody under contract. So Billy Wilder didn't have to go and raise funds to make his next movie. He was a contract writer-director for Paramount. Fred MacMurray was a contract actor at Paramount. And when Wilder wanted to cast this movie, they wanted him to use somebody they're already paying 52 weeks a year.
Yeah.
I mean, they would sometimes borrow talent from other studios, and that wasn't uncommon, if it was a big enough film and they thought it was important enough and the role was significant enough. But in this case, he approached the least likely person to play Walter Neff, the insurance agent, and he got a great performance that really is, it's perfect. It's just what it needs to be.
Well, I want to look at a clip. This is kind of the famous back and forth at the very beginning or early in the film between Fred MacMurray and Barbara Stanwyck, who plays Phyllis Dietrichson. Let's take a look at a clip from Double Indemnity.
Mr. Neff, why don't you drop by tomorrow evening around 8:30? He'll be in then.
Who?
My husband. You were anxious to talk to him, weren't you?
Yeah, I was, but I'm sort of getting over the idea, if you know what I mean.
There's a speed limit in this state, Mr. Neff. 45 miles an hour.
How fast was I going, officer?
I'd say around 90.
Suppose you get down off your motorcycle and give me a ticket.
Suppose I let you off with a warning this time.
Suppose it doesn't take.
Suppose I have to whack you over the knuckles.
Suppose I bust out crying and put my head on your shoulder.
Suppose you try putting it on my husband's shoulder.
That tears it.
So that's sexual tension before you could even have sexual tension in a movie, really.
How much would you give to hear an exchange that smart, that sassy, that sexy in a movie today?
Right.
You don't hear a lot of great dialogue today. Dialogue's not held at a premium anymore, but it was one of his specialties.
So one of the things that I also like is, again, you talk about casting against type. You have Fred MacMurray, who's usually the family-friendly guy playing the kind of the bad guy. He's not a good guy in this movie.
No.
And you have Edward G. Robinson, who's usually the heavy, playing the guy who's he's the heart of, he's really in a weird way the heart of the movie.
He is. He plays. It's a brilliant performance, I think. I don't think that's overstating it. It's a brilliant performance. And it's a brilliant character he's playing. He's a claims adjuster at an insurance company whose job is to be cynical, whose job is to think that everybody's a phony, everybody's lying just to collect their insurance. So that's how his mind works. And MacMurray reports to him and of course should know better than to try to put anything over on him.
Right.
And ultimately does know that.
And it ends, I love that and again, this is something that you don't see a lot in movies, is the last scene of the movie is a declaration of love between two male characters, the two lead male characters. And it's a friendly love, the love of friendship and respect and kindness. But again, the fact that they have a movie made in 1944 that ends with, Fred MacMurray telling Edward G. Robinson that he loves him, not something that you would see every day back in that time.
No, it's a fantastic film. I got to see it last year on a big screen, again, for the first time in a long, long time. Here in LA, we have something called The Last Remaining Seats. It's an annual series of films put on by the Los Angeles Conservancy at the Classic Movie Palaces, mostly downtown on Broadway. So to see it with a packed audience of 2,000 people at the old United Artists Theater, just spellbound. And you could feel how well it was playing. And I took my son-in-law there, and he's not an old movie buff, and he really enjoyed it. I mean, I didn't have to say to him, now look, this was made 70 years ago, and you got to understand this, you got to allow for that. He just enjoyed it.
Well, I believe we have, before we move on to Sunset Boulevard, I believe we have a caller on the line who actually has a question regarding both this film and Sunset Boulevard that I think is really interesting. Parker, welcome to Dan's Labyrinth.
Hey, Dan. Thanks for having me again.
Welcome. This is an interesting question. I thought you wanted to ask a question about the technique and how Billy Wilder opens both this movie, Double Indemnity, and Sunset Boulevard.
Yeah, I think that's two things that both those movies do, like in the very get-go, that I don't think a lot of movies can get away with. One, they show basically the ending, and two, it has that main character narrate the whole movie, and sometimes narration doesn't work very well. So I'm curious why you guys think it works really well in Double Indemnity and Sunset Boulevard, and how was this like a norm in film noirs, or was this a thing that reoccurred a lot in Billy Wilder's movies?
That's a great question.
It is.
Thanks, Parker. Yeah,
it is. It was not common. I think it's more common in film noir because there's a lot of first person. It was a rainy night. The streets were wet with whatever, that kind of thing. So we sort of accept that more in a lot of those films, those hard-boiled melodramas of the 40s and 50s. But to have the protagonist of the film dying and dead, respectively, in Double Indemnity and Sunset Boulevard, and those are not spoilers because the first scene, you learn that, was clever, unusual, certainly grab you.
It does, and thank you, Parker, for that question. Let's move on to Sunset Boulevard, 1950, the last collaboration between Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett, who was his partner kind of from the beginning of his career, and then this was their final movie together as collaborators. And as you said, it's a great grabber. The movie opens and your lead is dead, face down, floating in a pool, narrating his own story.
Yeah. Okay, you got me.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now what happens?
Exactly. And what I love about this movie, and I hadn't read this about it as much until I revisited it for the show, is how many feathers this ruffled in Hollywood when it was released, because this is a movie about the death of the silent era. and the people that it left behind. And I was reading stories of there were some very high-profile people in Hollywood that were not happy with Billy Wilder this movie.
The eminent Louis B. Mayer, who ran MGM and was one of the titans of Hollywood, was furious, absolutely furious at Wilder for what he called biting the hand that feeds him, for taking this myth of Hollywood that Mayer worked so hard to build and then maintain, this polished image of American perfection, and cast a seedy, glow over it. Now, glow's the wrong word. Well, anyway,
a pall, or something. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. and to do it in a very cynical way, and cynical is one of the things Wilder was.
Right. And this movie, if you didn't get a chance to watch it before the show, William Holden, who I think was great, was in Network, which was in our first movie club. Yep. A little bit younger here in Sunset Boulevard, plays Joe Gillis, a struggling writer. Gloria Swanson plays Norma Desmond, not a character not unlike herself, and sort of, at least in origin or in background.
Right. She had been a great silent movie star, and whose career had kind of waned with the coming of talkies. And though she still worked, did stage work and such, was kind of out of the limelight when Wilder cast. He really wanted Mae West, which is fascinating to try. I can't get my head around that. But he wanted the famous saucy sex comedian Mae West to star as Norma Desmond. But he got Gloria Swanson. And then he got Cecil B. DeMille, another exemplar of classic Hollywood, pioneering Hollywood, to play himself.
Right.
Which he does beautifully.
I know. I'd forgotten how good he actually is.
Well, he's a ham. He appears in his own coming attractions previews, and you get to see DeMille quite a bit if you dive into his work. But he was willing to be directed by Wilder, and they had a very good relationship, and those scenes are very poignant.
They are, and the clip that I pulled is just, I just love that this actually happened, and this is committed to film forever. It's such an example of art imitating life, or is it life imitating art? This is a clip of Gloria Swanson as Norma Desmond watching herself, who is also Gloria Swanson younger in a silent film, with Joe Gillis in this film, and kind of captures her entire motivation of just not being able to let go of these glory days of the silent era. Let's take a look.
Still wonderful, isn't it? And no dialogue. We didn't need dialogue. We had faces. There just aren't any faces like that anymore. Maybe one, Garbo. Those idiot producers. Those imbeciles. Haven't they got any eyes? Have they forgotten what a star looks like? I'll show them. I'll be up there again, so help me.
Now, if you see that out of context, it seems like she's giving a very broad theatrical performance,
right.
But that's what the character is.
It is. That's a performance that I think in a different script or in a different movie would be almost lampooned as just cartoonish. Yeah. But she makes that work for that character. She makes it work
because you believe her.
And everything is so grandiose in her life. She's in this huge empty house, these huge rooms that are just filled with knickknacks that are empty. I love the scene where they're at the New Year's party and she's hired a 4-piece orchestra just to play for her and William Holden. And I just kept thinking in my head, is like, what were they thinking? What was that orchestra thinking? They're at this old movie star's house. Nobody's there. The house is empty, but they still have to play. Yeah. That fit the character. And they knew how to write that character in such a way that didn't come off as over the top.
No, not at all. There's a third screenwriter on that film who almost never gets mentioned, named D.W. Marshman, who'd been a journalist and film critic that Wilder and Brackett liked, and they brought him on just for this one film.
And I wonder, I can't even think of an analogy to if this movie could be made again, because it's just Gloria Swanson. One of those chances, people put so much stock in the Oscars, and she did not win Best Actress for that movie.
No.
But that is by far a performance that people will never, ever forget.
No, it's one of a kind. It's lightning in a bottle, that movie, because of all the self-referential content, because it draws on so many real-life people. Hedda Hopper, the famous columnist, is in the last scene, playing herself. Buster Keaton and some other people turn up as themselves. but it's not gratuitous.
Right.
It's all organic. It all makes sense in the context of this bizarre kind of gothic fairy tale, you might say.
And I think, it's when you draw the lines and draw the dots, when people watch something like Tropic Thunder and they say, oh, how great it is that Hollywood can lampoon themselves, or that Hollywood can cast somebody as themselves, I think you can draw that line all the way back to this movie.
Yeah.
And say that, like, this is a movie about Hollywood with real people in it, but it's so well made that it just feels natural.
Yeah.
It feels like it's just nothing forced.
It does. It's a great film.
Well, moving on to my last one, and this is, I can't really pick a favorite, but this is this is the purest outright, I would say, if you're going to name one of these a comedy, I would say this is a comedy. Cameron Crowe has cited this movie as a major influence on him.
Sure.
The Apartment, the Best Picture winner from 1960, written by Billy Wilder, and I.A.L. Diamond, who he would then, he did Some Like It Hot, and would then, through the latter part of his career, would be his partner. And this is just, again, we talk about the balancing act in Sunset Boulevard with being too grandiose but making it work. This is a movie that balances comedy and tragedy.
Yes.
And the highest highs and the lowest lows so deftly and so well.
Yeah, and they serve each other, and they prop each other up.
Right.
And because again, you've got to have some conviction that these people live and breathe, that they're real, even if they're maybe Jack Lemmon's character may seem a little caricatured at times, but you've got to believe him enough.
Right.
You've got to believe him enough to go along on this journey, this emotional journey, and you do. And Shirley MacLaine is just perfect. It's she calls it one of her doormat roles. Women who let themselves get stepped on, and she was playing a lot of those at this time, but she did them really well.
She did, and that's interesting that she would say that because in the clip that I pulled, spoiler alert if you haven't seen it, it's the final scene of the movie. But I actually wanted to talk about that specifically as far as like her role in the movie, because I feel like she kind of, by the end of that film, completed a journey from that. But let's take a look here. This is the final scene from The Apartment. One of the great last lines in movie history. Jack Lemmon, C.C. Baxter, and Miss Kubelik.
What about Mr. Sheldrake?
We send him a fruitcake every Christmas. Cut.
I love you, Miss Kubelik.
3. Queen.
Did you hear what I said, Miss Kubelik? I absolutely adore you.
Shut up and deal.
What I love about that is you're right. Throughout the entire movie, she was, Fred MacMurray, again, playing not a great guy, was just walking all over her.
A heel.
A heel, exactly. A total heel. And what I like about that ending is that it didn't end in that kind of pat Hollywood ending of she shows up at his door and says, "I love you, Mr. Baxter. I've loved you all along." And I love the fact that she has the upper hand in that at the end of the movie. Is he's the one saying like, "I'm so in love with you," and she's the one that's just saying like, "Shut up.
Yeah.
Here, let's play cards." Yeah. And I love the journey that her character takes in that movie of just. I get the feeling that they are actual equals and that she's escaped this relationship where she's being a doormat. And she's found this guy who now they are equals.
Yeah.
And they complement each other.
They do. And they're well matched. They really, I think they will last as a couple. You get that feeling because we've been through such a journey with them. I mean, I don't want no more spoilers, but they've been through a lot. They've been through a lot by the time they get to that finale.
They have, and I love.
And in those days, by the way, movies didn't have tail credits.
Right.
Another thing you have to get used to when you watch older films is now you can have 10 minutes of crawl. All the drivers, all the assistant drivers, the caterers. You learn all of this. In those days, the movie ended when it said "the end." Sometimes there'd be a cast list, but that was about it. So when Billy Wilder and I.A.L. Diamond wrote their great last lines, like "Nobody's perfect," and "Some Like It Hot," or "Shut Up and Deal" in The Apartment, and then it says "the end," that's what they wanted you leaving the theater taking with you, is that summation of the movie, not drifting out of the theater,
just lazily
listening to music or
waiting for the after credit scene of I don't know.
Yes, yeah, the Marvel
Mr.
tease
Sheldrake
scene, yes,
coming
right.
back. I don't know,
Yeah,
whatever
right.
it is, that would be.
Yeah.
But it is a different era, but it's also so perfect. It's just it's almost like a comedian where you have your closer and then the lights come up and everybody walks out.
That's the punchline. Boom.
Right.
Boom. That was the idea.
So, like I said, I could say 3 more of these, and they're all so great.
When you say The Apartment to me, though, the first thing I think about is, again, production design, that insurance office. No, ad agency, rather. It's an ad agency, isn't it?
I think it might be an insurance office. They do some business there.
Yeah. It's the most incredible wide shot. It was done before computer imagery, CGI. I'm sure they used forced perspective and other tricks and all that. But it's this unbelievable, Metropolis-like, awful rendering of what it's like to be just a drone working in a faceless kind of corporate atmosphere.
Right. And I know, even if you want to, just talking the craft of it, I noticed just even small things that you just don't see anymore. Like they have a huge holiday party in one scene, and they have a scene where Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine are in his office, but behind them are not 5 or 10 people milling around, are probably 100 people, and there's
the ultimate. I mean, before this year's recent release, this was the ultimate office Christmas party in the apartment.
It was quite a Christmas party,
yes.
A very consequential one, and that's what I liked is each event. And I was sharing this with my girlfriend who'd never seen these movies, and one thing that she said was that she, and I agree that you don't see as much anymore, was these movies are all exactly as long as they need to be. They don't have anything less than they need, but they also don't have anything more than they need. They're economical. You start here and you end here, and you feel like every point that you hit along the way is a point that you needed to go to. And you also don't see that so much. It seems like now a lot of times movies, some of them, some aren't like this, but some just kind of meander a little bit.
Yeah.
And these are just so lean.
It's rare that I see a movie that I don't think could have been improved by being pruned.
Right.
A little bit.
Right.
And sometimes a lot. Even movies I like sometimes just go on a little too long, or longer than they need to use your phrase.
Yes.
And you never get that feeling here.
No.
You never get that feeling here.
They end right when they need to, and they start right when they need to.
Yeah. It's great story construction and great savvy in how to communicate to an audience. And he certainly had that in spades.
He did. And I hope that, part of the reason that I do this is I want to recommend 3 films from these directors, and hopefully people will seek out even more films from them. Are there any more that you would recommend? I mean, we could talk all day about other ones.
Oh, well, I mean, he made so many great films. Some of his early stuff, I like Five Graves to Cairo, which is not talked about very much, but I like very, very much. The Lost Weekend, which was a groundbreaking film about alcoholism, dated in some ways, in some positive ways, and maybe in some not so positive ways, but still very, very bold and daring for its time. A Foreign Affair, wonderful film about post-war Germany, and very daring for Billy Wilder, immigrant Billy Wilder in particular, to take on, because he went to Berlin and worked for the government in some of the post-war cleanup operations and repatriation and things, and then he made this cynical, wonderful comedy.
Right.
Again, how does he do that? But he did. Stalag 17, the ultimate prisoner of war movie with William Holden,
right,
which was based on a hit Broadway play. Some Like It Hot, which we just mentioned in passing, maybe the greatest comedy of all time.
Right.
Arguably the greatest comedy of all time.
That was my 4th. If I could have done 4 movies, the 4th would have been Some Like It Hot.
I like 1, 2, 3 with Jimmy Cagney, set in West Berlin during the Cold War. Again, a film of its time, but that transcends the years at the same moment,
Ace in the Hole is one.
Oh, Ace in the Hole is a great film.
I think that's a film ahead of its time.
It is.
More relevant today than it was when it was made.
Starring Kirk Douglas in one of his great performances, one of his many great performances, about a guy who's trapped in a sort of a mine disaster, a small-scale mine disaster that traps this poor fellow, and how it becomes, as we call it today, a media circus. And you're right, it's like 40 years ahead of its time.
It is. It is. Well, the show's called Dan's Labyrinth, and part of it is I want to try to help guide people, not just through what's coming out today, but for some movies that I love, movies that I think people should see, and you invented that. I've had, and I want to talk about. You've got the classic movie guide through 1965. I had, I probably had 2 or 3 of these various versions of them on my bookshelf growing up, and you were one of the original guides for me through classic movies, modern movies. So I just want to say thank you, number one, for being here and for helping to kind of build my love of movies, because I don't think you can love movies today without seeing and learning about what's come before.
Well, that's what I've always believed. You have to know where you've been to appreciate where you are and where you're headed, where you're going. And the more informed you are as a movie watcher, moviegoer, the smarter you are, the more you can appreciate. And the more demanding I think you should be. You shouldn't accept second-rate, third-rate stuff when it could be first-rate. And how are you going to know if you don't see the really great stuff?
I agree.
And we were talking just before we went on the air, if you still call it on the air.
Sure. Yeah. I still say, like when I miss a show, I still say I'm going to tape it. So I'm fine with still using it on the air.
Good. Because we were talking about, we made a reference to Marvel, and I don't see any discrepancy in liking all the cutting-edge current stuff, all the new ways and new things that are happening in movies, and the new voices, the new filmmakers, and loving classic cinema too. Why not? I mean, Quentin Tarantino and Fred Astaire. Why not?
Right.
You can like them both. I do.
It's the same language. It's just different dialects.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is people say, oh, I don't like old movies. Like they're the same as the movies that you're watching.
Yeah.
They just happen to have been made earlier.
Yeah.
And I love trying to get that message out.
And don't be afraid of black and white. Don't give me that hooey that you won't watch black and white. If it's good, it's going to grab you.
Right.
And if it's not, it doesn't matter if it's in color.
Exactly. Plenty of terrible movies in color that I've seen.
Yeah.
A lot of them from last year. Leonard Maltin, thank you so much for coming in. If you don't have one of Leonard's classic movie guides, it is as advertised. It is a guide to classic movies and what you need to see. So pick them up in bookstores and Amazon, wherever you can, and just watch movies. Really, more than anything, find the movies you like and watch them. Mr. Maltin, thank you so much for coming in today. I really appreciate it. This was so much fun.
Fun for me too. Thank you, Dan.